please tell us a bit about when and why did you decide to become a management scholar?
Wow, when you look at a photo of all those people I've been working with, that's a great list of people to work with. I guess I've been fortunate to work with such excellent people and have some great mentors. When I decided to become a management scholar was in fact when I was a consultant working in the London office of the Boston Consulting Group, way back. And at the time when I started as a consultant, BCG came out with a concept called time-based competition. Maybe some of you remember that. And it was extraordinary because here I was 25 years old. You could take a concept like that and walk into the office of a CFO who was, say, in his 40s, and you can have an intellectual conversation based upon an idea. And the idea was if you can cut down time, you can gain a competitive advantage. And that was an idea that was rooted in the organizational capability of the firm versus the strategic position of the firm, which was, for BCG was a change in its approach. And that concept was so powerful and it was so successful with clients. And I thought to myself, wow, a management idea like that can have such an incredible impact. And I decided that was so cool. So I'm going to go into academia. And I asked around at the time when I was in London, and the professor I had in accounting, Anthony Hopwood at LSE, who was a great inspiration to me, he said, go to America and take a PhD. And from there I just started to apply to management departments and to do that. But so the seed for me was not a theory paper out of academia, but it was really a very powerful idea that came out of that time in consulting. So that was my origin for why I went. And of course, then I went to Stanford, and I met a whole different cast of characters. Like people like Mike Hansen and Jim Martz that had a very different orientation towards the same, the idea of research. But that was a great transition. But that was the origin of it.
So now moving on to more about your PhD life, you've told us that you were primarily interested in evolutionary theory, and you also published a piece with Bill Barnett in SMJ. So how could you transform your research interest into more network theory?
Right. So when I was at Stanford in the 1990s, I was looking back at it. Probably one of the great. You're lucky to be in such an incredible environment as a PhD student. I sort of think of it as maybe one of the peak times in management theory certainly at Stanford at the time. The strategy scholars were very active and vibrant at the time. Organizational behavior was vibrant. You had people like Steve Barley, Kathy Eisnard in the engineering department. You had Mark Granovetter and Mike Hannon. Population ecology was huge at the time, if you remember that. No longer is. But evolutionary theory with Nelson and Winter was a very big deal. I thought that was a great set of theories. In fact, I did my preliminary exam with your PhD students. You can choose your specialty and take an exam at Stanford at the time. I chose to do it in evolutionary theory, with examiners being Jim Martz and Mike Hannon. So that tells you a little bit about the sort of the academic flavor of it. And I even went over to the philosophy department to take a master's course in the logic of evolutionary theory or something like that. But I run into a hard reality that I'm sure many people in the room have done before, which is there's one thing about talking theory, there's another thing to get empirical traction on that theory. And I think evolutionary theory model is one of the most difficult things to do, particularly if you want to study things inside of organizations. And so the closest I got to that was the Red Queen paper with Bill Barnett, which is a unique data set that allows you to kind of partition some of these different causal mechanisms. But it was, I basically, maybe I chickened out. I gave up. And so the other big thing that was going on at the time was social network theory. So I did a pivot. But it was born out of my interest because I thought, okay, if I'm going to study evolutionary theory, what I could study, and I had gotten access to Hewlett-Packard at the time, which was a large company, a great place to study in empirical. I thought, can I study their project over time? Because then again, an evolutionary theory of project performance. The problem was that they threw away their data after 7 years. So if you're going to study something evolutionary, that's not long enough. So I remember I went to Colorado to see if I could find more data in the archives that they had over there, but the guy had thrown them away. So that was, but then at the same time I was studying project teams, and I'm trying to understand why they were so successful. And then I quickly started understanding that one of the ways in which they were successful was the knowledge sharing across Hewlett-Packard. And that was sometimes done extremely well, and it was done extremely poorly. So again, it was driven by the phenomena at the time. And that was the pivot wasn't just, it was born out of that kind of experience with the phenomena. That's why I pivoted.
So talking about your ASQ article in 1999, the search and transfer problem, it's a great example of bridging phenomena and theory. So the phenomena is the product innovation through knowledge sharing, and also the theory is the social network theory. Could you tell us more about how you bridge the two?
Yeah, I think for me, it wasn't, and we approached and developed theory and empiricism in different ways, and for me, it wasn't, I mean, my approach has always tried to bridge theory with practice. It's been my kind of shtick. But it wasn't, it was actually coming at it from two different places. So one place is the phenomena. You go to Hewlett-Packard, you understand why. The phenomena I was trying to study, the interesting question for me wasn't why some had more knowledge than others, or why there was more collaboration with others. That was not the interesting question. The interesting question was, why are some benefiting from the knowledge and doing it well, while others are still doing it, but doing it terribly, so they actually are hurting from it? That was interesting. But on the network theory, I came at it from sort of the other end. I took a network PhD course with Stephen Barley. It was a terrific course. And we spent a lot of time on Mark Granovetter's theory of weak ties. And I thought that Mark Granovetter's theory was very incomplete. It was a half part of a theory. And I wrote a paper kind of attacking Mark Granovetter's weak tie theory. And essentially the argument was, Mark Granovetter was conceiving of the problem as search. I just had to find a job. But once I found the job target, I'm fine, right? That was the problem that he described. But as we know, with these kind of problems, finding a job or job opportunity is just half the problem. The other problem is actually getting the job, right? So I consider I called, in fact, in my thesis, I don't call it search transfer, I call it search realization problem. So first you've got to search to find something. And then you need to realize the opportunity. And sometimes that has to do with the willingness of the party to share the knowledge. It could be trivial knowledge, but they still need to share it. They're hoarding. And the second is, even if they are willing to share, it's complicated knowledge that is difficult to transfer, hence the transfer problem. So I thought that Mark Granovetter addressed half of the network problem, but not the other half. And I wrote a paper on that course about that, and that really became the foundation for the thesis. And Mark Granovetter was at the campus at the time, so I made an appointment with him, and I went to him and I showed him the argument. And he said, yeah, I think you're right about that, you should go and write about that. So that was a completely sort of theoretical formulation of the problem. And then I had this phenomena that I've seen in Hewlett-Packard, that they were messing up knowledge transfer. So why was that? And so then I just combined the two, really. It was a combination. It wasn't backing from theory into practice or practice into theory. It was sort of saying, okay, if we have an incomplete theory over here, or contradictory theory, really, because it's contradictory because if you have weak ties to find something, those are poor ties for transferring something complicated, right? So it helps you with the first part of the problem, and it undermines the second part of the problem. So that's interesting theoretically. And over here it was, we're messing up knowledge transfers. So, can one speak to the other? And that became the foundation of that paper.
So we say that the pendulum has swung widely within the strategy field. It started out from being practitioner-oriented, and it searched strongly for a theoretical foundation. But Morten's work has kept kept an eye on being relevant to practitioners even when it was out of fashion. So we now want to ask Morten about how he thinks about the rigor and relevance debate.
Okay, that's a difficult question. So I said that my shtick has always been to try to bridge the two. I think historically the field of strategy has been very good at that. You can argue that a lot of the theory came out of practice almost. I think the rigor part is we need to develop better data, better methods, and I think that's a good thing for the field. It's getting better. When I read an article today, overall it's better data, it's better method, it's better done than it was 20 years ago or 10 years ago. That's a great thing. I think it would be a shame for the field if by increasing the rigor, we increasing the irrelevance, because ultimately what is the beneficiary of the field, at least in my conceptualization, which is only one way to do it, is that ultimately we want to inform practice or help practice. At least that's the way I think about it. But we can't do that with poor theory or poor methods. Then we're just becoming we're not. Our sort of field is based on the idea of being academically rigorous. I mean, it must be like that. But increasing, having rigor and relevance at the same time, that's a difficult thing. And I find as a scholar trying to be upright in the middle, it's sometimes hard. It's easier to say, I'm just going to focus on A-list journals and I'm going to play that game. It's not easy to do, it's very hard to do. That's clear. But it's easier in the sense that I only have to do one thing and do it well. If you're going to add one thing to do relevance as well as that, right? So it's like you're trying to do both and, it's not an or, then that's sometimes difficult. And I would say that for me personally, sometimes I feel like being stuck in a hole in the middle. It's like Ron Burt has this theory of a structural hole, and it's always beneficial to be in that hole, bridging two different worlds, right? But being in that hole, can also be difficult, right? These two different worlds. And but what I've chosen to do is to say, well, that's what I want to do. I just find that really, really. I think it's fun to be in that place. Constantly talking about theory that informs practice, and practice that can help shape the theory and understand the phenomena. And if you look at the diversity of people that I've been working with, up there, some of my early mentors were Mike Hansen, Jim March. You had Bill Barnett up there. They're not exactly practitioners, right? They're very theoretical in their orientation, but you learn a great deal from them. And so, to me, the bridging the two is trying to tap into the diversity of both. That's the way I've been approaching it.
So, what kind of advice would you give to the young scholars who are trying to bridge the two, theory and the context?
So, to me, it's a little bit of I would actually, starting out today, what my advice would be make sure you really excel at the rigor. Go to a place where you can get great PhD education, train yourself in one method and be really good at it, and know your theory and make sure you have a theoretically strong argument in your thesis, and then add in addition how it relates to the phenomena of interest. But the danger, I think, and I remember I've seen a number of candidates coming through, and I saw this tendency at the Harvard Business School when I was there. You sort of start with a phenomena of interest, and then you start to back into theory or add some data to it, and it becomes sort of a little stuck in the middle. And I think if you're really, really great at the rigor, but then kind of add the relevance dimension, then I think you can now suddenly combine the two. You're bridging the two. And there are a number of papers out there that are really scholars who do that, and when it works, it's really great to see. And but they cannot be attacked of saying, well, you're sort of bridging practice and theory, but it's sort of half-baked. It isn't, right? It's really done extremely well. And the only way you can do it really well is that you know your theory and you know your methods. So, I mean, for me, there's an example of that from that search transfer paper was, okay, so I needed to know the network research inside and out. And then, I mean, you've got to stand in front of people like Ron Burton and defend your work. And then secondly, the method that I ended up doing was a hazard rate model of completion time. Well, you better know hazard rate models because you need to defend it in front of Mike Hannon, who's an expert on hazard rate models. So I went and enrolled in his graduate seminar on hazard rate models to make sure that I could be to that level. And that's what I mean. Make sure you double down on the few things you want to do well on the rigor side, and then I would sort of add the relevance side. And that's the way I approach it. I think you can really harm your career if you try to do sort of like half of both. It doesn't work. You won't get a job, I think. Not today. Maybe people have different views, but that's my view. I think that's very difficult. Yeah.
So, in your work, you have shown how technology has changed the way organizations and teams function. So, what different changes do you think the emergent technology will bring?
Emergent technologies. And I'm saying that because it means that I'm immersed in the Silicon Valley 100% of my time. And I'm sure we are biased in one direction, but I'm just shocked, or I just think we're living through this incredible revolution right now, both in terms of digital businesses emerging in industries where we wouldn't think that they would emerge. I think Uber is a great example of a taxi industry is now a digital platform. But second, it's also in the automation of work and the role of technology in reshaping the nature of work, and also by implication reshaping the nature of management. So for me, it's may you live in interesting times, and I think the interesting times we're living in is this incredible digital revolution that is going to have major impact on our field. And I'm thinking about this interest group is sort of like so well placed to take advantage of those changes. Right? It's fundamentally about innovation and knowledge, and how that is going to, these technologies are going to reshape work. I think we're in the beginning of that. I'm sure it's overhyped, but artificial intelligence, it's the algorithms are going to fundamentally change, the nature of management and work and how we organize work. I find that's going to be my next field of research, and to break that into some kind of academic research, and many people are working on that already, of course. What I find less interesting about it is forecasting job displacement. That's interesting from a policymaker, but from the field of management theory, it's not so interesting. I think it's more interesting how we're going to interact with the technology and how we're going to organize and how companies are going to gain competitive advantage as a result of these changes. That's very, very interesting. In early days.
So with all these changes happening, how do you think the field of strategy can remain relevant?
I think it's a very good question. I think you have to, first of all, you have to study the phenomena, right? It's not I think there are a lot of fads going on in Silicon Valley and technology, and those are not so interesting to study. 4 years ago, it was about variables as the major thing that was going to change everybody's life, and it hasn't, and it's moved on. But you've got to study the phenomena. So the question is, are the papers, are the academic research studying this phenomena of digital revolution and automation of work? And if not, that's a problem for a field, right? You're stuck in sort of the past. But the second is, I think, more interesting is that I think you need to have new theories and new concepts. And the field strategy, what I like about it is that it has been developing concepts over time. Right? It's not that old, the field. It's like 50 years old. But it's where it is now with dynamic capability view is very different from where it was 20 years ago. And so what is then the next thing? I think that's where it needs to go to understand these different configuration we are seeing. I mean, and some scholars are doing that. We now have platform companies like Uber and Airbnb, and they are fundamentally different in some ways than more traditional corporation. Super interesting. We might need a new theory or new perspectives to understand how they actually work and what it means to be, in those kind of fields. So I think that's going to be the challenge for the field.
So you've mentioned your ties to the Silicon Valley. Could you talk a little bit about your role and what you hope to get out of it? But a lot of consulting companies are aggressively moving into leadership development. What do you think this means for the business schools going forward?
So I think executive education in business school is going to go through enormous disruption, and I think business schools are going to be in for a really tough time. And I've been saying that for several years. I think that many business schools might, if they're really dependent on exec ed, might just go under if they're not careful. Because first of all, think about that market. You have new entrants, right? You've got McKinsey and BCG and others are just firing up. So the head of the initiative, BCG, sent me some material on this, and I looked at their portfolio stuff they're doing, and I told him, look, you look like a business school with this material. And he said, yes, that's what we're looking at. It's an add-on to everything else they're doing, and that's just one player. And then you've got, so you've got all these new players. You got online. Online is just in the early days, hasn't gone so well so far, but that's going to be coming. And I think it's going to be vastly better and much more aggressive, and there are all these different models out there. And it's going to be far, far better. So you got those two big trends. And then you got the uncomfortable truth that maybe exec ed is not being that impactful as it could have been. Delivered by the business school, it's been kind of a bit of a lazy business. Great teachers and fantastic classroom experiences, but that doesn't mean it translates into impact for the company. So put all those forces together, I think it's going to be a very, very difficult time. And opportunities for those who can do it. I mean, we teach disruptive, creative destruction. We teach that as part of our strategy curriculum. This is happening to ourselves and will happen in an increasing scale, I believe. And it's really fun to be in Silicon Valley because here the people are not seeing themselves as being disrupted. They're seeing themselves as being the disruptors of the place, and that's including executive education. Now, some business schools I know are really somewhat advanced on this, but many are lagging. And I think it should be a wake-up call for a lot of people to be ahead of the curve and not behind.
So you mentioned about future of work as your future interest topic that you would like to work on, but could you tell us more about that, or what other topics are you interested in moving forward in terms of research, writing?
Future work is kind of like future work in management. You talk about a big field, right? I would be honest to say that I'm kind of in the beginning of formulating my own view on that. If we have algorithms that run a lot of work, do we need managers? And if we need a few managers, how many and what are they supposed to be doing? If you have A/B testing and experimental kind of experiments that drive the direction where you're going in terms of products and product markets that are working, then what's the role of strategy and deciding on the strategic direction if instead that direction is much more emergence on the basis of where those experiments are taking you as a company? And an example of that, somebody was talking to Facebook and asking, are you into online marketplaces? Well, it depends on whether we can actually get traction with our experiments in online marketplaces. And if they do, and if they find a way forward, suddenly 3 years from now they're going to be a big player in online marketplaces. But if they don't with experiments, they may not. But that's very different from somebody sitting in corporate strategy and saying the online marketplace business looks attractive is a positioning argument, and therefore we should be in it. So I think a lot of these technologies are going to be moving in the direction of much more emergent strategy. I mean, that's going to have this kind of renaissance, or maybe it has already, but these technologies, I think, are playing in that direction, not in the direction of sitting in a corner office and plotting strategy. And I kind of tease my friends at McKinsey with that and saying, well, if that's true, all we need is to run experiments. We don't need McKinsey anymore. Of course, they push back on that, but it's an interesting, I think a lot of companies in the Valley operate that way. I mean, it can lead to myopic search, of course, right? So that's interesting. But I think a lot of the roadmaps are more of that kind. So I find that interesting. I find the nature of experimentation as part of strategy and using technology for that super interesting. And so I'm going to study some of that as well. Yeah.
So as our last question, how do you see your role as a scholar, and what do you want your legacy to be?
So if I think of people who have inspired me, like someone like Sumantra Ghoshal, for example, was this idea of bridging theory and practice. And so what I want to do is to work towards that one thing. And that is to say, can we bridge theory and practice? And by so doing, can we just help this organization do a lot better? That to me is I want to be part of that trajectory of scholars who have devoted themselves to that purpose. And if I can play a small part in that, that would be great for me. I would hate for this great field to move in the direction of theory for its own sake. Right? The theory should have a greater purpose, and that to me is the purpose. And so I'm just, if I can play a role in that, that would be great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Very intriguing and interesting. I've looked at corporate universities quite a lot, and it seems to be them very much about developing individuals as opposed to organizational learning.
Okay, it shouldn't be about sort of individual leadership development. It should also be about organizational development. Yeah. There's a limit to what I can say about that, but I can say that the new courses that we have developed specifically right now is about enabling the organization to function at a large scale. And that is about the relationship between leaders and how they help the organization work, and therefore how the organization can be different and more efficient when you have this scale that it has.
Can you comment on what other ones are doing wrong then? Maybe that might help.
Other corporate universities?
Yeah.
I mean, many of you know that better than I. I mean, there are different models at the same problem. Steve Jobs decided to invest a lot of time and resources in building an internal unit. I think a lot of companies don't have the stomach for that, right? You got to build a very large or a sizable organization. And there's one thing where I think maybe some universities, companies get it wrong, and that is, I think, when they almost contract with business schools, where the business schools are really just delivering almost off-the-shelf stuff, and they come for a week to campus, but it's not really customized. And I myself guilty of this. I've been showing up in executive programs and not knowing a lot about the organization that I'm about to teach. Sometimes you get away with that, right? And sometimes it's sort of like misfires, I think. I think that's the corporate university needs to be much better at that. I think tailoring it.
Hi, I was curious to hear more on the knowledge, I guess, management knowledge generation side, because your career, while having this huge impact on the field and being so productive, but you have really spanned public university, private university, universities, private sector. And we've had periods where strategy knowledge has been generated much more in the private sector. So I guess I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on the accumulation of management knowledge and how much that's happening in private organizations now and how it's different or similar.
Oh, that's a great question. I think in Silicon Valley, and maybe they're just full of hype, but there's a huge amount of generation of new management knowledge. And of course, I think there are people in Silicon Valley who think, well, we disrupt with technology, but we're also disrupting management thought, right? And some of them are reinventing the wheel because they don't know any better. So they come up with something they think is really fantastic. Turns out it was said by some scholar, 20 years ago. And without mentioning names, I know that's going on. But I also think that there are people are questioning the status quo, and they're coming up with new ways of managing and new ways of running companies, and not necessarily beholden to old management theory. And many of them are not coming out of business school, so they don't have the framework that we give them as a straitjacket, but they kind of come up with their own framework. So I think certainly with the Silicon Valley, and again, I think some of it is hype, and you should take it with a grain of salt, but some of it is really new, yeah. So my personal hunch is that I think there is a lot of interesting stuff coming out of management, the practice of management, but in different places, and maybe this is wrong, but some people commented on GE the other day, some journalist, and he said it's been a long time since people went to GE for new management thought. Maybe that's not correct to say, but they said it. The fact that they said it means that it's shifted to different kinds of companies. When I was at Harvard Business School, we taught GE as the gospel, right? That's how you do general management. It's GE. They're the best. I think people now will look elsewhere, and that's quite interesting, right? I mean, just one example: the lean startup movement. It's a practice, it's not a theory. But I think a lot of companies, big companies, are trying to do innovation that way, as opposed to with larger teams. And maybe we said that before in the field. But certainly that's a trend.
Morten, I just was curious a little bit if you could talk about your. I mean, there are we mentioned a few of your books, earlier books, in your collaboration with Jim Collins, how it has shaped you, how it has help evolve your thinking, and same thing with your stint with collaboration with the book.
Yeah, I think for me it's been a blessing and a bit of a challenge to work with so diverse people, right? So you have to understand, so when I got to Stanford, before I was enrolling in a PhD program, I said I need to find this out, what is academia about coming from consulting. So I went and I spent a year working on this book that became eventually titled Built to Last, but it was a kind of research project. And then I got into the PhD program, and then I remember the first week I was with Jim Barron and Mike Hannon, and having spent a week with them, I understood what research really was. It's quite different from a book like Built to Last, right? It's like night and day. I mean, if you take, Mike Hannon here and Jim Collins, you're just on the continuum, are two very extreme people, right, in terms of their orientation. I have enjoyed that. It's been sort of like being with a set of scholars who are very theoretical, and then being with people who are kind of very rooted into practice. And so it has been that kind of melting pot for me. And I say I struggle at times because sometimes you live a little bit of a schizophrenic life, to be honest, but it's also been very rewarding. And that's why that's how I got to know Jim Collins, and that's also why I worked with him later on. That was the reason why. But I seek diversity. I mean, if there was one principle that has worked for me really well, it's been seek diversity of people you work with, and not just work with the same people who are like you. And, it's an irony that we think about, we know that from group diversity research. Creative ideas comes from different diversity of people. Yet I think often as scholars we might narrow ourselves. At least that's been for me. I don't know if that answers your question, Gabriel, but...
It's just about sort of your own trajectory, like what happened to your thinking when you interacted with these diverse people, especially with someone like Jim?
Yeah, so Jim is not a scholar the way we think about it, but what I like about Jim is he first of all, he interacts with a lot with CEOs of big companies. That's kind of his home territory. And from that, he always asks the big questions regarding phenomena. And that's kind of, sometimes I think in scholarship we can get stuck in smaller questions, not seeing the big questions, questions of method, questions of a variable, questions of a hypothesis. And then it's refreshing to speak to someone like Jim who is just asking the very big questions, because he asks those, in part by being, with CEOs who ask those big questions. At least you get a chance to ask those big questions. And that's a nice bridging. And that's kind of informed my thinking. Right. Yeah.
Very insightful session. One question I have is a very general question. Research is a continual process of rediscovery. What do you think of the relative importance of induction versus deduction, theory building versus theory testing, and how might it vary in different substantive issues? Admittedly, a very general question.
Right. Well, I've done both. Deductive, I think, hypothesis testing in the more quantitative papers, and then inductive theorizing by doing field research in the interviews. I certainly feel that both are really valuable. And one thing I think we need in the field, and in the field of knowledge and innovation, you need a big tent. And I think you need to sort of see that there are different research methods that can give to different discoveries. And I think we're not always as good as we should be of tolerating and respecting people who have a different taste for different kind of research. But I think when we do, there's enormous value in terms of grounded theorizing that leads to discoveries of new interesting hypotheses, and then also deductive research that is testing and developing those further. What I don't think we're very good at as a field is accumulation of knowledge. I think there have been certain areas of strategy research where it's been terrific. If I look at the topic of sort of related diversification, you can find 150 studies that are really damn good. Other areas you can find very little, right? So I think, you get published in A-list journals if you come up with something new. I don't think we're very good at sort of replication testing, right? And of course that has become a bigger deal, right? But we need accumulation of knowledge, right? So to your point there, I think while you're accepting both sort of orientation, I think it's great if one all can kind of spend a little more time kind of building upon each other and replicating research. I think that would be great as an addition to the field. I don't know if that's answered your question, but I like both ways.
So, Morten, we have another question for you. You have written a lot about how to succeed collaborating, and you seem to publish more collaborating with others than on your own. What it is about collaboration that appeals to you? Because you said yourself that it's hard to go back and forth sometimes between diverse types of scholars.
Yeah. My one criterion for working with others has been, would I enjoy working with that other person? That's the criterion, right? I think you can say you have complementary skills or other reasons to working together, but if you fundamentally do not enjoy working with that person, or do not respect that person, or you don't think you will have a good time working with each other, we all know it's going to lead to a lot of friction and it can just go wrong. That's been my one criterion, right? So, you know, with Martin sitting in the back there, we did a lot of scholarly work together while I was at Harvard and Martin was at Harvard. And I can't remember the first thing we did, but I think it was one of your PhD papers or something. But I just realized it would be great to work together. And we did a number of papers together. And that was the criterion. Same with Louisa as well. You know, it's a who question, it's not a what question for me. It's always been. And then I enjoy it. I think it's also the enjoyment of working with other scholars. It's just been great. Not always easy. Yeah.
Morten, you've also worked at many different institutions, and quite different institutions. So Stanford, and then you went to Harvard, and then INSEAD, and now you're at Berkeley. How do you think those different institutions have affected the progression in your academic career in terms of research and generally development as a scholar?
I think these institutions are far more different than we think they are. Well, first of all, I would say I think management consultant is so different from, say, at Stanford. I didn't understand that, and I don't think they understand it if you're on either side of that. And it's far bigger divide. I mean, you get strategy practitioners sitting at BCG, and you get strategy scholars sitting at Stanford, and they are so different. And so jumping from one to another was like a shell shock. Across schools, I think, at least it used to be, a very big difference. I mean, I think Stanford was, at least when I was there, extremely, maybe even more so now, extremely theoretical, extremely academic. I mean, Jim March was, I remember he wrote an article in the Stanford magazine when I was there. Somebody was saying, the dean was saying we should do rigor and relevance. And Jim March's response was, we should do rigor in face of relevance. That's what counts. Typical Jim March kind of argument. And then you jump to Harvard Business School, at least when I was there, it was much more oriented towards practice. I think that might be changed. Maybe it will come a little more similar. And it used to be much more different. I mean, Berkeley is a different, it's a state school, and it's a, I mean, maybe many have this problem, but it's a problem of having resources, basically, to a large extent. And that's not true of some of these other names I just mentioned. It's a different problem. But I would say that these different business schools, or at least I've been experiencing, have been very different, and maybe they're converging more, and I don't think that's for the better.
Last question from the audience? No? All right.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.